Okay, guys, so this lecture is about thalamus. It's chapter 14. So here is the location of the thalamus. This is the mid-sagittal view. So that thalamus is part of the diencephalon. There are two of them, one on each side, and they are connected with each other by the interthalamic adhesion. So in the middle, this area is actually the third ventricle is located there. And above that, you can see the corpus callosum, there's the fornix and other stuff are there. And below that, you can see the hypothalamus and the brainstem is here. If you cut it like this coronally, then you can see the location of the thalamus here. So there's two of them, as I said before. In the middle, you will have the third ventricle here. You have the lateral ventricles here. This is the septum pellucidum, and this is the corpus callosum. And below that, you have the subthalamic nuclei are there. Substantia nigra is around here. They just put it there all the way, so it's located around here. And if you make a transverse cut like this, then again you can see the location of the thalamus and these two separated from each other by the third ventricle, and these are the lateral ventricles there. You can also see the lentiform nucleus, which is made of the putamen laterally and globus pallidus medially. And lentiform nucleus is separated from the thalamus by the internal capsule. This is the internal capsule. And this is just a part of the caudate nucleus here. So these are the different nuclei of the thalamus. So we start with this image. So thalamus is divided by different group of nuclei. The first one is the lateral group. So this whole area is the lateral group, and that is separated by internal medullary lamina, which is just the nerve fibers from other nuclei here. So the lateral group is divided into the dorsal tire and the ventral tire. The dorsal tire is made of the lateral dorsal, lateral posterior, and pulvinar. So there's three of them here. And the ventral tire is made of ventral anterior, ventral lateral, and ventral posterior. The ventral posterior is again divided into the ventral posterolateral and ventral posteromedial. So ventral posteromedial is smaller, ventral posterolateral is bigger. And these are the abbreviations. So this is the full name of the abbreviations. This area is the anterior nucleus, and medially this is the dorsomedial group there. You also have the geniculate nuclei. So this is the lateral geniculate nucleus, and this is the medial geniculate nucleus. If you cut the thalamus like that, then you have an image like this. So there is two thalami, one on each side, as I said before. In the middle, they are separated from each other by the third ventricle. You have the dorsomedial nucleus here medially, which is this one, and you have the lateral dorsal as this one, and this is the big one. So the ventral posterior nucleus, which is made of two other nuclei, ventral posterolateral, this area, and ventral posteromedial, which is this one. You can also see a small portion of the ventral lateral here. So these nuclei are separated from each other by the internal medullary lamina. So this is the internal medullary lamina. And here there's a couple of other nuclei are there that you cannot see in this view because they are located deeper. These are called intralaminar nuclei, and one of them is called centromedial, is this one, and there is also parafascicular that you cannot see it in this view. There is also another group of nuclei which is located most superficially, and these are called thalamic reticular nucleus. So one on each side, and these are they have an extensive connection with the cortex of brain. So the thalamic nuclei are divided into three different groups. So one is relay nuclei, the other one is association nuclei, and the third one is the other category. So they couldn't find any better name, and they said, okay, this is the other guy. So they put it as the other category. So relay nuclei are processing sensory, motor, and limbic system, and they contain the ventral group and the dorsal group and anterior nuclei, and also the geniculate nuclei. So there's a lot of different ones, and they have a connection with the cortex of brain, so it have a bilateral communication with the cortex of brain. Association nuclei, these are the dorsomedial and pulvinar, and they also have connection with the cortex of brain bilaterally. And finally, the other category is made of two different type of nuclei. One is intralaminar nuclei, which is the centromedial and parafascicular, and they connected with the basal ganglia and the limbic system. The reticular nuclei, reticular thalamic nuclei, are connected with the cortex of brain very extensively, and it's very important with consciousness. So now let's talk about each group of nuclei separately. So the first one is the sensory nuclei. The sensory nuclei are the ventral posterior nucleus. You can see it in this coronal section. So this is the ventral nuclei. It's made of the ventral posterior lateral and ventral posterior medial. So this is the third ventricle there. So we start from this diagram. There is two different nuclei, and they're receiving different information. So the VPM is receiving information from the anterior trigeminal thalamic tract, and if you remember that this is part of the trigeminal nerve, and that is receiving pain and temperature information. The trigeminal lemniscus is also part of the trigeminal nerve, and that is carrying tactile information, proprioception, and vibration to thalamus. And from the thalamus, from VPM of thalamus, it goes to the somatosensory cortex. The other one, so this is a smaller area that's located in the face, part of the trigeminal nerve, and the rest of the body is coming from these two areas. So one is spinothalamic, and that is important for pain and temperature, that is coming from upper limbs, lower limbs, body walls. And the other one is the posterior column medial lemniscus, and that is carrying fine touch, vibration, position, and proprioception. And they go to the VPL, and from VPL it goes to the somatosensory cortex. So this area, this image explaining the same thing. So you have the peripheral information, spinothalamic and posterior column medial lemniscus information from most of the body that is goes to VPL, and information from the face goes to the VPM through the anterior trigeminal thalamic and trigeminal lemniscus. It goes to thalamus, processed there, and important information is then sent to the cortex of the brain. So this is the central sulcus, and this is the postcentral gyrus, and that is the primary sensory cortex. And this is the area that is responsible for conscious understanding of the sensory stimuli. And this table is explaining the same thing, it's just in a different format. So this is relay nuclei. These are the sensory relay nuclei, VPL and VPM. The VPL is getting information from the dorsal column, medial lemniscus, and an anterolateral system. The spinal thalamic is part of the anterolateral system, and that goes to somatosensory cortex. And from the face, there's two different tracts, trigeminal lemniscus and anterior trigeminal thalamic tract, and that's because the different sensory stimuli are sent from the face through these two tracts, and that goes also in the same area, somatosensory cortex. Then is still we are in the relay nucleus, and we are in the sensory relay nucleus. These are the special sensory, so geniculate nuclei. One is the medial geniculate nucleus, and the other one is the lateral geniculate nucleus. So starting with the auditory system, so there are hair cells, and then that goes to, that is in the cochlea, and that goes to the spiral ganglion, which is not shown here. If you want to write it, you can write it, the spiral ganglion. From there, it goes through the cochlear nerve to the cochlear nuclei, through the cochlear nerve to cochlear nuclei, and from there it goes through the lateral lemniscus to the inferior colliculus. Inferior colliculus, if you remember, is in the midbrain, and from there it goes to the medial geniculate nucleus of thalamus through the inferior brachium. And from thalamus, it goes to the primary and auditory association cortices. The visual information is in the retina and the eyes, and from there it goes to optic nerve. So if you want to write it here, optic nerve, optic chiasm here. And when we get to the visual system, you can understand the more details of that. So optic nerve, optic chiasm with CH, and then is the optic tract, and from there it goes to the lateral geniculate nucleus, and through from here it goes to the cortex of the brain, primary visual cortex and visual association cortex. That is through the optic radiation. Optic radiation. Okay, so that's the name if you want to write it. And this diagram is explaining the same thing, but just like in a diagram format. So you can see that information is coming from the eyes, going through the optic nerve and optic tract, and then it goes to the lateral geniculate nucleus, and finally ends up in the occipital lobe, which is, this is the primary visual cortex. These areas are visual association area. And the auditory information, it is going to the spiral ganglion and the cochlear nuclei, and then inferior colliculus. From there it goes to the medial geniculate nucleus of thalamus, and from there it goes to the primary auditory cortex, auditory association area, and that is in the temporal lobe. Then is we are still in the relay nuclei. Now is the motor relay nuclei. So here is the ventral anterior and ventral lateral nuclei are involved here. So if you see it, this is the ventral anterior, this is the ventral lateral. So this is cut is more anteriorly. So this is the ventral anterior, this is the anterior nucleus, and this is the dorsomedial nuclei. And if you cut it a little bit posteriorly, then you can see ventrolateral here, and medially you can see dorsomedial, which is this one. So information from basal ganglia, which carries basal nuclei, the same name. So different textbooks have different names in it. So motor information from there, it goes usually to ventral anterior, and from cerebellum usually goes to the ventral lateral. The information is processed in the thalamus, and from there it goes to the motor cortex. From motor cortex, information comes down to the basal ganglia. Thalamus also has a connection with the basal ganglia, and also motor information comes back to the thalamus, and from there it goes to the cerebellum. So when we get to the basal ganglia, you will know the pathways a little bit more detailed. So for now, we understand that there is a bilateral connection between the basal ganglia and cerebellum, and thalamus, and thalamus is providing information to motor cortex, and then motor cortex goes back and provide information back to the thalamus and basal ganglia, and indirectly to cerebellum. So in this image, same idea there. So you have basal ganglia and you have the ventral anterior and ventral lateral, and from there it goes to the primary motor cortex, which is the one that is conscious usually for fine movements in the distal part of the body, and the supplementary and premotor cortex, and that is for other parts of the body, more proximal and the torso areas. So those areas. And this table is explaining the same thing. So we are in the motor relay nuclei, and the two nuclei that are involved is the ventral anterior and ventral lateral. They receive information from the basal ganglia and cerebellum, and then it sends information to the primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, and supplementary motor cortex. Another one is the limbic nuclei. So this is still part of the relay nuclei. In the limbic system, there is different pathways that's connected to thalamus. So one is the mammillary body, and mammillary body is connected to hippocampus through fornix, and then mammillary body connects to anterior nucleus through mammillo-thalamic tract. Thalamic tract. Entorhinal cortex, this area, you can see this area, that is connected to the lateral dorsal, and areas that's coming, information that's coming from different parts of the limbic system. It goes to the dorsomedial. So this is dorsomedial nucleus. And then also there is other parts of the limbic system that is shown here in this image. This is the prefrontal cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex, the cingulate gyrus, the parahippocampal gyrus, the entorhinal cortex. These are all part of the limbic system. So this is the area that is connected directly or indirectly with the thalamus. So this is a good flow chart. So from mammillary body, it goes to anterior nucleus, so mammillothalamic tract, and from anterior nucleus, it goes to cingulate gyrus through the internal capsule, and that is important for memory and also for attention. So cingulate gyrus has an important function for memory. Entorhinal cortex, from there it goes to the lateral dorsal nucleus, and from there it goes to cingulate gyrus and parietal cortex. That's for motivation, attention. And from different parts of the limbic system, the information goes to the dorsomedial nucleus, that again goes to cingulate gyrus, prefrontal cortex, and orbitofrontal cortex. And this is important for inhibiting inappropriate behavior. So something that is not a social norm, and that's the cortex of the brain is responsible for it, and you consciously don't want to do it. But sometimes some people are, for example, doing things that suppresses the cortex of brain. For example, they are drinking a lot, and that suppresses the cortex of the brain, and the inhibited areas are now released, and then they do things that they shouldn't do. Just an example. And it's also important for the executive function. So the executive function is important for self-awareness, for emotional control, for planning and problem solving, for working memory, and also for self-motivation. So it has a lot of different functions, and that is mainly in the prefrontal cortex. That's the main area. But one more thing that you can notice here in the limbic relay system, so you can see the cingulate gyrus is everywhere. So cingulate gyrus receive a lot of information, and then that takes it to somewhere else. So from cingulate gyrus, it goes to some other parts of the cerebrum. So association nuclei. For association nuclei, you have the pulvinar and dorsomedial nuclei in the thalamus. So thalamus is receiving information from basal ganglia, from reticular formation, from brainstem nuclei, and also from other part of the limbic system. So these are information. These are the different stimuli that is received by thalamus and the pulvinar and dorsomedial nuclei. And the thalamus is now connected with association cortices. So you can see that the association cortex, you can see in all lobes are there. But there's another pathway there too, that these cortices can also connect with each other directly, which is in this image. So if you remember, superior longitudinal fasciculus, and this is arcuate fasciculus, this is uncinate fasciculus, and this is the inferior fronto-occipital fasciculus. So these are also direct pathways that connecting one lobe with another lobe. The problem with that is that it is slow, but thalamus is located in the middle, and it is easier to carry information from one part to another part. So this connection of the thalamus is actually increasing the speed of conduction of the information. So in the example I can give you is like a airport. So for example, Chicago or Dallas or New York is like a big hub for multiple airlines. So they're connecting international flights that come there in those major airports, and from there then it can the airplanes can go to other smaller destinations. So it makes it easier and it's more manageable, and it's better that way. So same idea there. Here is the pulvinar is important for both visual processing visual information and auditory information. So it's bilaterally connected and getting bilateral communication between pulvinar and visual association area, and also pulvinar is connected with the other association areas in the brain. So both in the visual system and the auditory system, pulvinar is connecting different association cortices. For visual system, it's important for visual salience. Visual salience is actually the same thing as attention to a specific visual stimuli. So I don't know why they put it, is because it means the same thing. And part of the working memory is actually visual salience. So if you want to concentrate on something, and if, for example, you're manipulating something, you're fixing something, you're drawing something, and that's a visual memory. So then you are focusing on that and you're doing that specific task. For the auditory system, the function is the same thing. So comprehension of the speech and other sounds, so for understanding auditory information, and also for short-term memory is important. For example, you're listening to this lecture, so you're connecting multiple sentences and multiple information together to make sense of a bigger picture. So that is a short-term auditory memory. You can see that the pulvinar here is connected to the different association areas. So, and the output is also same thing. So the input and output is almost the same thing, except the retina, which is just an input. But for the brain itself, different parts of the brain, the association areas, the input and output is the same thing. So this is the same thing as this area that you can see that the association areas have bilateral communication with the pulvinar. And then the pulvinar has a specific communication with the auditory and visual association cortices. We are still in the association nuclei. So as I said before, there's two of them that are responsible for this. One is the pulvinar and the other one is the dorsomedial nucleus. Here the dorsomedial nucleus has a bilateral connection with the entorhinal cortex, and the entorhinal cortex is part of the limbic system that provides information about odor and other types of olfactory sensory stimuli. It also is connected with the limbic system, and here the dorsomedial nucleus is receiving information from amygdala. If you remember, amygdala is for emotional memory, especially the negative emotional memory, and then it sends information to cingulate gyrus, entorhinal cortex, and a hippocampus, which is again part of the limbic system there. So that is for emotional response to any kind of motor activity. And the dorsomedial is also connected with the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia function is for coordination of limb motor activity, so that way it helps with the motor activity. And it's also connected with the prefrontal cortex. Dorsomedial nucleus filters some information, and information that it thinks is important, it sends it to the prefrontal cortex. So that's the gating information. Not everything is sent there. And it's also part of the executive function, which I talked about it before, like paying attention and planning and all those kind of activities, the problem solving and working memory, all those things are part of the executive function. And all of these areas are bilateral connections. So dorsomedial nucleus have bilateral connection with the prefrontal cortex, entorhinal cortex, basal ganglia, and the limbic system. It's a bilateral communication. So the other nuclei, one of them is intralaminar nuclei. So there's two of them, centromedial and parafascicular. And these nuclei receiving different information. So this is a cholinergic information that's coming from the brain, and that provides acetylcholine to the cortex of the brain, and that is important for wakefulness and arousal and concentration. Also, norepinephrine is important for wakefulness and focus. It goes to different parts of the brain. The areas that are really important for wakefulness and arousal is the frontal cortex and also parietal cortex. Centromedial and parafascicular also receive dopaminergic input, so that coming from the VTA ventral tegmental area, VTA ventral tegmental area, that is close to the substantia nigra. The function of this is related to the reward system and also learning and emotion and also orgasm. So it has multiple functions. And that provides dopaminergic function there. Then is the intralaminar nuclei are connected with the striatum. Striatum is part of the basal ganglia. So one is caudate nucleus and one is putamen. Both of them together is called the striatum, and there's pathways there, so that's why they put it together. And here the intralaminar nuclei decide which kind of information should be sent there to the basal nuclei, because they are important for motor response. So that is they are deciding. So not everything is sent there. And I also already mentioned about the cortex of the brain, that information dopamine and cholinergic and acetylcholine is sent to the cortex of the brain, but acetylcholine is more important for arousal. Dopamine here, it goes to the prefrontal cortex, and that's part of the reward system. The other nuclei is the thalamic reticular nucleus. So here is thalamus is receiving most of the sensory information, if you remember it. The only exception is that does not receive direct information from the cranial nerve 1, but the rest, all sensory information is received by thalamus. Then thalamus sends information to the cortex of the brain. The cortex of the brain is now processing the information, and depends on the type of information. But remember that the thalamus already filtered some information. So the things that were important is sent to the cortex, and then now the cortex concentrates on the stimuli that are more important. For example, a painful stimulus is more important than a tactile stimulus. So then sends positive signals through the thalamic reticular nucleus, and TRN is actually inhibiting other nuclei there. So that way the thalamus does not need to resend the same information, because cortex wants to concentrate on a few stimuli. You don't want to feel everything that is there, because that way the brain will not be able to concentrate on a few specific things and prioritize on a specific task. So that's why that's the function of the thalamus, to send information that is important, that's vital about surrounding area. And the consciousness. So what is the consciousness? This is a very difficult answer. Okay, it's very difficult to know what is consciousness. If you are asking a philosopher, they may give you a different different definition than a neuroscientist. So mainly the awareness of the surrounding and awareness of self is a consciousness. And for the consciousness, usually you have the information, you're processing information from general somatic afferent, a special somatic afferent, a special visceral afferent, but most of the time you do not process general visceral afferent. So only in some specific conditions you can consciously become aware of general visceral afferent. Also, you will be consciously aware of general somatic efferent and special visceral efferent. These are for skeletal muscle, but you may not be aware of the general visceral efferent. So the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, most of the time you may not be aware of that. For the consciousness, you really need a lot of different inputs. You have emotional inputs from the limbic system. You have the reticular formation that processes sensory and motor information. Reticular formation is really important. Once it gets sensory information, it wakes up and then it sends it to other parts of the brain. Also, any motor activity that you do, the reticular formation is awake and keeping the brain awake. You can get the proprioceptive information from cerebellum, and that's in the thalamus. You also get a different type of the sensory stimuli like touch and pain and temperature, things like that, from the spine and also from the brainstem through the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. You also get the special senses from the eyes and from the ears, taste and things like that. So and you're also getting motor information from the basal ganglia. So all of them are sent to the thalamus, and then the thalamus communicates with different part of the cortex of the brain, and there is bilateral pathways there. So there's a thalamocortical from thalamus to cortex, and corticothalamic from the cortex back to the thalamus. So it is communicating with each other, and the job of thalamus is that to make the body aware of something that is going on right now. So that synchronization is really important, that anything that's happening outside or maybe inside the body, the person has to be aware at that moment. And the nucleus that is really important is the thalamic reticular nucleus. This is really important. It has a lot of connection with the cortex of the brain, and then it activates different parts of the brain, and also it deactivates different parts of the thalamus, depends on the type of stimulus. So that's why you can make it focused. Also, intralaminar nuclei are important for consciousness and cortical awakening. The blood supply of the thalamus, this diagram actually in your textbook does not provide all the information. So the easier way to understand this is start from here. So this is the basilar artery that it branches and become the posterior cerebral artery. This is the internal carotid, and that is branching to the middle cerebral artery, and there should be anterior cerebral artery, which is not there. So on the posterior cerebral artery, you have the posterior choroidal artery that is giving some branches to the thalamus. And in the middle cerebral artery is anterior choroidal artery that gives some branches there. You have also here the posterior communicating artery that is connecting the middle and the posterior cerebral arteries, and that gives branches to the thalamoperforate arteries. And sometimes in some people, the thalamoperforate may also start from the middle cerebral artery. Another area that's not there, so I thought I should put it here, is the anterior cerebral artery that gives branches. It's not in this image. It gives branches in the anterior part of the thalamus. And another one is called lenticular artery that is actually branches of the middle cerebral, and it goes and supplies this area. So these two are not there in this image, so I thought I should write it here. There's also a smaller artery here. It's called thalamo-geniculate nuclei, and that's supplying the geniculate nuclei there. It's a smaller one. And you can see the coronal section, and this is the thalamus, and this is the posterior cerebral arteries there. And also this is the transverse one, and this is the posterior cerebral artery. You can see this one. But again, it does not indicate all other arteries that should be here. It should be middle cerebral artery is also here. It's giving some branches here. It's not shown here. And this is lenticular artery around here. And about different diseases. So one of them is infarction of internal capsule, and that area is supplied by lenticular artery. This is the branch of the middle cerebral artery. So if you remember, the information that are going to the cortex or leaving from the cortex, it can cross the midline either in the brainstem or in the different part of the spinal cord. So here, if there is a damage in this area, you get a contralateral sensory problem, sensory loss, and also you have paralysis. The paralysis is with a positive Babinski sign. So it means what? It means this upper motor neuron problem, not lower motor neuron. You get a lower facial weakness because of the cranial nerve, and this is because it's upper motor neuron. If it was lower motor neuron, the half of the face would have muscle weakness. Also, you get damage as a pathways for the area that's processing visual information. So geniculate nucleus is damaged there, and that's why you get a hemianopsia, which means half of the vision is visible, the other half of the visual field is not visible. So half you can see, the other half you cannot see. And I will come back to this later when we get to the visual system, chapter 15. Another disease is thalamic syndrome, and that is by occlusion of posterior thalamoperforating artery. Here again you get a contralateral hemiparesis and contralateral sensory loss there. but you also get something else. So there is changing in the pain pathways. If there is any total damage there, you may not feel it, or you may get a different type of pain, that very severe pain, that's called hyperpathia. And this is a neurogenic pain. This is not the same as other type of pain. So this is a central pain, not a peripheral pain. So that's why the treatment is also different. It does not respond to the normal, painkiller medications. You also have atitotic movement of the hand. So this is called a thalamic hand. What is atitosis? It is a kind of slow, rhythmic, continuous twisting of the hand and feet. So this is called atitosis. So you can see there are different diseases. One of them is in the thalamus. There is not a full explanation why these things are happening, and this is why you have syndrome. So some of the stuff is easier to explain, but some other stuff is not very well explained. That is it for this lecture. So if you have questions, we can talk about it when we meet.